Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Qatar Economic Forum. Now, we may be joining virtually today, but this forum is anchored in Doha. Over the next 3 days, you'll hear about a wide array of global economic issues and the challenges and opportunities they present. Our accomplished speakers, from heads of state to business and policy leaders, will discuss evolving technologies, education, culture, sustainability, and the impact on the economy. Through it all, the conversations will be moderated by Bloomberg anchors and editors from financial centers across the world. As many countries emerge from the pandemic and others continue to struggle with their public health and economic consequences, this is a critical moment. So I hope you can get a lot out of the forum, and I wish you all the best. And now I'd like to welcome His Highness Sheikh Tamim Al Thani, the Emir of the State of Qatar.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدات والسادة، يسعدني أن أرحب بكم جميعا في منتدى قطر الاقتصادي الذي يعقد بالتعاون مع مؤسسة بلومبرج، والذي يمثل منطلقا لسلسلة من المنتديات الرامية لإثراء الحوار حول الاقتصاد العالمي والانتقال إلى مرحلة ما بعد كوفيد-19. ونحن على ثقة بأن النسخة الأولى من المنتدى ستشكل إضافة نوعية للجهود المشتركة لدولنا ومجتمعاتنا، والتعاون بينها وبين قطاع الأعمال في مواجهة مختلف التحديات وبناء مستقبل أفضل لكافة شعوبنا. السيدات والسادة، يأتي اجتماعنا اليوم ونحن في خضم المواجهة مع جائحة كوفيد-19، والتي شكلت تحديا خطيرا وغير مسبوق للإنسانية جمعاء على كافة الأصعدة، بما في ذلك المجال الاقتصادي، حيث دارت نقاشات لا حد لها حول المفاضلة الوهمية بين صحة الناس وصحة الاقتصاد. وطغت الضبابية على توقعات المؤسسات الدولية بشأن الآفاق المستقبلية للاقتصاد العالمي، خصوصا أن العالم لم ينتقل حتى الآن إلى مرحلة ما بعد الجائحة في ظل موجات العدوى المتجددة وتحورات الفيروس التي أكدت حالة عدم اليقين. وعلى الرغم من ذلك، فإن صندوق النقد الدولي قد أشار في تقزيع اللقاح، وقد نجم عن تكيف المجتمعات مع ظروف الجائحة تطورا كبيرا في التكنولوجيا الرقمية، بما في ذلك إتاحة فرص العمل والتعليم عن بعد على نحو غير مسبوق. ولا شك أنه سيكون لذلك شأن في اقتصاديات ما بعد الجائحة أيضا. لقد أعادت الجائحة طرح أسئلة كبرى متعلقة بعلاقة المجتمعات الحديثة بالطبيعة، وتوقعات المجتمع من الدولة في شأن سياسات الصحة العامة، وعلاقة الدولة بالاقتصاد، والتعاون العالمي في مواجهة التحديات العابرة لحدود الدول والقوميات والثقافات، مثل الأوبئة والتغير المناخي والفقر وقضايا اللاجئين. وقد ثبت مرة أخرى أنه أولا لا يمكن تجنب معالجة هذه الأسئلة، وكل حدث كبير كهذا يعيد تذكيرنا بها. وثانيا، لا توفر المقاربات الحادة إجابات حقيقية، فقد ثبت مثلا أنه لا غنى عن دور الدولة بعد أن نعاه العديد من الخبراء في عهد العولمة. فكما في حالة الأزمة المالية الأخيرة في العامين 2008-2009 تبين أن توقعات المجتمعات في حالة الجائحة موجهة نحو الدولة، وأن دور الدولة لا غنى عنه. ومن ناحية أخرى، ثبت أنه لا يمكن التغلب على تحديات كهذه بالاعتماد على جهود الدولة الوطنية فحسب، فجهود المواجهة لا بد أن تشمل المجتمع المدني وقطاع الأعمال، ويجب أن تكون منسقة عالميا، وكذلك الاستثمار في الأبحاث وتوقع الأوبئة القادمة وإنتاج اللقاحات وتوزيعها. هذه أمور لا تترك للدولة الوطنية وحدها، ولا لقوانين السوق والتجارة العالمية وحدها لتنظمها، لقد ثبت مرة أخرى أن الإجابات النظرية والأيديولوجية الحادة هي إجابات مضللة. السيدات والسادة، لم تألو دولة قطر جهدا في الاستجابة السريعة لمواجهة التداعيات الخطيرة للجائحة، حيث وجهنا باعتماد استراتيجية تقوم على 3 محاور أساسية تتمثل في حماية كافة أفراد المجتمع عبر تعزيز القطاع الطبي ولا سيما قطاع الصحة العامة، وتقديم الدعم اللازم للاقتصاد للحد من التأثيرات السلبية للجائحة، والمساهمة في الجهود الدولية للتصدي للفيروس من خلال تقديم المساعدات للدول والمنظمات الدولية المعنية. وبناء على هذه الاستراتيجية اعتمدنا برنامجا وطنيا للتطعيم ضد الفيروس، وتخطى البرنامج مؤخرا عدد 2,800,000 جرعة، حيث حصل إلى اليوم ما نسبته تقريبا 65% من السكان على اللقاح. كما وجهنا باتخاذ جميع الإجراءات اللازمة للحد من التبعات الاقتصادية للجائحة، وتقديم دعم للقطاع الخاص المتضرر مقداره 75 مليار ريال. وقد اعتمدنا المرونة وعدم التطرف في إجراءات الفتح والإغلاق لتكون نهجا رئيسيا في التعامل مع الوضع الراهن، بناء على تجاربنا السابقة في مواجهة الأزمات، حيث شكل التفكير الاستباقي وسرعة التأقلم مع مختلف المتغيرات ركيزة أساسية لتحقيق التقدم في خططنا وبرامجنا التنموية، ولا سيما بتعزيز الاعتماد على الذات قدر الإمكان في المجالات الحيوية، واعتماد التنويع الاقتصادي ودعم القطاع الخاص وتحفيز الاستثمار لتحقيق رؤيتنا الوطنية. السيدات والسادة، استعدادا للمرحلة القادمة حرصنا على انتهاج سياسة اقتصادية متوازنة عبر مواصلة توسعة مشروع الغاز في حقل الشمال، بهدف زيادة إنتاج الغاز الطبيعي المسال بنسبة 40% بحلول عام 2026. وسوف تستخدم عائدات هذه الزيادة في تعزيز استثماراتنا لصالح الأجيال القادمة، مما سيسهم في تنويع مصادر الدخل. كما قمنا بدعم القطاعات غير النفطية والتي تجاوزت مساهمتها في الناتج المحلي الإجمالي 61% بالأسعار الثابتة عام 2020. وتوجهنا في هذا الإطار إلى تنمية الصناعات الصديقة للبيئة وإرساء الأطر التشريعية الداعمة لجاذبية بيئة الأعمال، مثل إصدار قانون تنظيم استثمار رأس مال غير القطري في النشاط الاقتصادي، وقانون تنظيم الشراكة بين القطاعين الحكومي والخاص، علاوة على الاستثمار في قطاعات حيوية وهامة، ومن بينها الصحة والتكنولوجيا وتطوير المناطق الحرة، ومواصلة توسعة مطار حمد الدولي وميناء حمد، بما يرسخ الانفتاح الاقتصادي لبلادنا ويعزز علاقاتنا التجارية مع مختلف الدول. نحن دولة مصدرة للغاز الطبيعي، وهو الطاقة المنخفضة الكربون والأقل خطورة على البيئة، ومع ذلك فإننا نستثمر في الأبحاث المتعلقة بالطاقة الخضراء والطاقة البديلة والمستدامة، ونخطط لتنتقل قطر إليها، كما نسهم في الجهود العالمية لمكافحة التغير المناخي. نحن ندرك جميعا أن المرحلة القادمة لن تكون سهلة اقتصادية ومالية على أي دولة من الدول، ويتوجب علينا أن نتعاون لتضييق الفجوة بين الدول المتقدمة والنامية، خاصة في الحصول على اللقاح ومواجهة تداعيات الوباء. لقد اتخذت دولة قطر خطوات كبيرة في هذا المسار من خلال تقديم المساعدات اللازمة لأكثر من 80 دولة ومنظمة دولية، وتعهدنا بتقديم الدعم لمنظمة الصحة العالمية والتحالف العالمي للقاحات والتحصين جافي، والعديد من المنظمات والبرامج الدولية الأخرى، على غرار برنامج كوفاكس الذي يهدف إلى وصول اللقاح بشكل عادل ومتكافئ إلى أكثر من 92 دولة محتاجة للمساعدات الإنمائية الرسمية بنهاية العام الحالي. ولا يفوتني هنا أن أؤكد على أن التوصل إلى لقاحات لمواجهة فيروس كوفيد-19 يعد جهدا إنسانيا محمودا، إلا أن تسابق وتنافس بعض الدول في الحصول على كميات تفوق حاجتها منها سيسهم بتعثر الجهود الدولية الرامية للسيطرة على الوباء عالميا، فضلا عن عرقلة مسيرة التنمية في الدول النامية والفقيرة. ومن هذا المنبر أدعو قادة دول العالم خصوصا الدول الصناعية الكبرى إلى مزيد من التعاون في إطار النظام الدولي وتقاسم المسؤوليات والعمل معا من أجل التوزيع العادل والشامل للقاح، بما يؤسس لنا لبناء نظام اجتماعي واقتصادي عالمي متكامل، وبما يتماشى مع أهداف التنمية العالمية المستدامة ويحقق الخير والاستقرار لشعوبنا. أشكركم جميعا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you, Your Highness. In 2020, the pandemic sent the world's economy into freefall. The IMF says global economic activity shrank by 3.3%, the biggest since the Great Depression of the 1930s. An estimated 150 million people tumbled down the socio-economic ladder. South Asia and Africa were among the hardest hit. The IMF forecasts that world GDP should grow by more than 6% this year. The signs are promising, but the virus continues to lurk, and its menacing presence looms over any possible recovery. South Africa and Rwanda are two nations in its crosshairs. To discuss their challenges, we have Presidents Cyril Ramaphosa and Paul Kagame. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa joins me now. Your Excellency, it's lovely to see you after such a long time. Thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to start by asking you this. How badly will the Johnson & Johnson contamination problems in the United States affect South Africa's vaccine rollout?
Well, as it is now, it is affecting it quite negatively. We were supposed to have received quite a number of vaccines, but this contamination has delayed that. But we're rather pleased that Johnson & Johnson has agreed that they will replace those 2 million that we would have had, those that have had to be destroyed. They will replace them, and our vaccination process will get back on stream, and hopefully it will move a lot faster forward.
Do you envision reducing the order of 31 million doses from Johnson & Johnson and replacing it with other shots?
No, Johnson & Johnson vaccine has a number of great advantages for us because it's a one-shot jab dose, and yet the others are 2 doses. So that is preferable for us, particularly because a number of our people are in the rural areas and they have to be reached. It's better if we reach them once rather than twice. The other part of it is that the logistics are much more favorable because the storage thereof is quite good. It's just fridge temperature rather than very low temperatures. So that is conducive for our own situation. So we will not seek to replace or to reduce the 31 million. We will still need to add others, as we are doing so now with Pfizer, and we may also get to Sinovac. But Johnson & Johnson is going to be, if you like, the base load vaccine supply that we need. And more so because it's also produced here in South Africa. The factory is in the south of the country, in Port Elizabeth, which we now call Gqeberha. So made by South African workers, much as it is fashioned or developed by Johnson & Johnson, which is an American company.
Your Excellency, you have a situation where cases are surging. You just recently enforced new restrictions. You've had all these huge vaccine setbacks. And there's a third wave now in South Africa, and the vaccines aren't there. How did South Africa get in this kind of a situation and is now one of the least vaccinated nations in Africa?
Yes, we've just had a number of very unfortunate situations befalling us. We were supposed to be among the first of the blocks, as it were, when we ordered and got a supply from India of the AstraZeneca. We were meant to get, right at the start, 1 million. And our scientists, who are really good and well-renowned, had already started doing their work to find out what the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine would be. And they found that we had a different variant of the coronavirus, and that the AstraZeneca would not really be appropriate for the variant that we had. So we had to drop that and had to then give them away to the rest of the continent. And that led to a time lag and a wait. And then we got the Pfizer, but in the meantime, we had already finalized an agreement with Johnson & Johnson, which we had already started using, which was part of the earlier process of finding out the efficacy of Johnson. So we were held back, but we are going to be back on stream, because we now are firmly able to do about 100,000 a day, 150. We will be moving to 250,000 vaccinations a day. And so we will catch up the time that we have lost.
President Ramaphosa, what do you say to countries and pharma entities as well that are against patent waivers to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines? You've been very vocal about that. What do you have to say to them?
Well, we see that their refusal to waive this intellectual property provision that they have as a part of vaccine nationalism. And we just don't understand the sense of it all, because all we are asking for, together with India, is that there should be a waiver for a 3-year period to enable countries that have the capability to be able to produce the vaccines. India and South Africa have the capability, and so do a number of other countries in the developing economy countries, and particularly on the African continent. And we say the continued refusal leads to inequity on vaccine. We are facing an emergency that is affecting the entire world, and it is wholly unfair and wholly unjust that pharmaceutical companies, as well as certain countries, are refusing to allow this provision to be waived so that there can be mass production of these vaccines so that we can save lives. And I think it is selfish, it is unjust, and it is wholly unfair. And we are going to continue insisting that there should be this waiver, because we want to save lives, and that should be prominent in all our minds and in everything that we do, because no one is safe anywhere in the world without everyone being safe.
Pre-pandemic, Africa had 7 out of 10 countries in the world that had the fastest growing economies. Now, when you look at the continent, we're looking at something like, I believe it's negative 2.5% growth. And for the first time in 25 years, the continent is going to go into recession. How do you see an African recovery situation amid the fact that we're still doing emergency and response?
Well, our recovery as the African continent at an economic level is going to be constrained, and it's going to be rolled back. The progress that we were recording is going to be rolled back. And that's why we are saying that we need support, particularly those countries that are finding themselves in real dire straits. The developed economies are going to be getting 650 billion rand in SDRs, and we say some of those should be made available to economies or countries in Africa. And we've asked for 25% of that 650, which would amount to something like 160 billion. There is now on offer 100 billion, and we say, thank you very much. We need that, but we need more because our economies are going to need a lot of support. And it is only fair that a continent that has been growing by leaps and bounds should receive that type of support, because all of us must get out of this economic slump that has been brought onto us by COVID-19.
The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa puts that number needed for recovery at $400 billion. How are we going to close that financing gap?
Well, I think we can try all efforts to close that financing gap. The special drawing rights should be made available. Some debt needs to be cancelled that countries have, and more support should be given in debt payment delays. And there should also be support for infrastructure projects. There should be support for health programs that we have. And if we can do that, we can get closer to that 400 billion. But without that support, Africa will forever be left behind. And Africa had demonstrated that given the chance, it is able to surge forward. And we are saying what we need now is to be given that opportunity. We can get up and going with our own bootstraps, but we do need that lift. And developed economies have a duty. The other challenge is climate change. Africa is suffering from the ravages of climate change when it is least responsible for the damage that has been caused to the world climate. So we are saying on that as well, the developed economies must live up to the promises that they made, because we do need to have a differentiated approach on addressing climate change. Some of our economies have been ravaged and devastated because of climate change due to floods, droughts. So countries are having to utilize their budget to close these gaps. So support is needed, because it is important that all of us as countries in the world should grow, and we must grow together as we improve the lives of our people.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, thank you so much. And as we say in Kenya, asante sana.
Asante sana. Thank you.
Your Excellency, President Kagame, thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to see you here. My first question is, how will Africa be able to have adequate vaccines for its people?
Well, simply, Africa has to be equal partner with the rest of the world. And when it comes to manufacturing vaccines, instead of waiting for vaccines from those places where they manufacture them. And right now, Africa is busy trying to do exactly that, to find partners to start manufacturing vaccines on our continent. We have IFC, we have European Union, we have other partners that are willing to come and do exactly that with our continent. Once that is up and running, I think we should be able to get vaccines we need on time or at the same time with the rest of the world.
One of the key conversations that is happening right now on the continent is the establishment of an mRNA vaccine plant. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and where you are in the process in conversations with manufacturers, et cetera?
Yeah, in fact, there are going to be, like, so far 3 hubs on our continent. And these countries are advanced on that. That is South Africa, Senegal, and Rwanda. We are going to be these hubs on the continent where manufacturing of vaccines is going to happen. For Rwanda in particular, we have partnered with some industries that are specialized in mRNA technology. This is a new technology that has wide applications in agriculture or other diseases. And so we have already discussed with the people with that technology. We are discussing with people who will help with the financing. And I think in a few months, we should hear a different story.
Speaking of financing, and you know better than anyone on the continent how hard our governments have hard-pressed they have been for revenue following the pandemic. Is Rwanda looking to return to the international financial markets to sell a Eurobond?
Every country in the world, more or less, they are looking for ways to mobilize funds to invest because of how economies have been affected by the pandemic, and Rwanda is no exception. So to begin with, Rwanda has been having a very good B+ credit rating. We want to build on that. We have a solid debt management framework. So the Eurobond is one good option that will provide us with the resources that we are looking for.
President Kagame, French President Emmanuel Macron has apologized for the French role in the genocide. What were your thoughts when you heard that?
It is very important that there was first this visit of President Macron and the statement he made that was important, that outlined the basis of the apology he made to Rwanda and Rwandans, referring to the French involvement in our history in the genocide that took place in our country. This was very important in terms of not really so much about the apology, but about the truth of what happened. I think he came out on the side of the truth. Admitting this responsibility was important. Important in many ways, because in the recent years, we have noticed increase in the denial, in the revision of the genocide history, and all kinds of narratives beginning to form as if really to create a different story. So, and France has been a big part of that. So with the truth that came from President Macron and the admission he made of France's responsibility, I think this helps to manage this otherwise negative development that we have noticed in the recent years.
Now that that truth has been spoken, will Rwanda seek more economic opportunities with France?
Inevitably, with the better relations and on the basis of this truth that has come out and putting things in largely the right perspective, we shall see, and we are likely to see better cooperation and joint investments in places and areas that matter for our development as Rwanda, and I'm sure in the end it benefits France as well. This kind of cooperation is very important, and we are looking forward to that and building on leaving this ugly history of ours behind us and being able to forge ahead is what Rwanda is looking for.
What would you say to international investors who are looking at Africa, wanting to invest, wanting to seek partnerships in the context, however, of a really difficult economic and health pandemic situation on the continent? How do you see the future of partnerships and investment in our current context?
I think there is absolutely hope for that to happen, the investments to happen in Africa by different countries or other continents. One, just to be clear, when sometimes Africa has had problems, we still have problems. But the analysis of those problems, I think, are mainly put out of context. It's as if there are no problems elsewhere. But I think even in other places, even the rich countries have their own problems. So what we do, for example, in Africa, it's a matter of stability, it's security. It's so that those who are looking to invest can feel comfortable, they have their investments secure. Now, there are different areas that are problematic on our continent. But those problems in those areas are also being addressed. There are other areas where even when they have problems, you can invest as well as the problems that are being addressed at the same time. Then we have countries in Africa that actually don't have any problems to worry about when people are making investments. So the story has...
Pardon me, I was going to say, and the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is a really key part of this, isn't it?
It is a key part of that. It is one of those things Africa did not have to wait to put in place before we address all the problems. So African Continental Free Trade Area is going to be the largest almost in the world. And it helps more intra-trade on our continent, one country to another or among ourselves, but it also helps to create this very huge market to, in fact, attract investments from other areas, because this is a lucrative market, very big, and again, in the background, there is going to be the immense resources on our continent that the world actually needs. So we just have to make these loose ends meet so that capital, different funds, resources can really be invested in and with Africa.
Rwanda's President Paul Kagame. Thank you so much, Your Excellency.
It's a pleasure, always. Thank you, Vaji.
Thank you to both presidents for speaking with me. We really want to hear from you and talk to you on social media, so please follow us on Twitter at Bloomberg Live and do use our hashtag Qatar Economic Forum. President Biden and President Putin met for the first time in Geneva, one newly elected, the other entrenched in power. Their talks impact countries around the world. One such nation is Armenia, located in the Caucasus and on the border of Europe and Asia. We talked to President Armen Sarkisian for his insights on big power rivalry and the small nations caught in the middle.
We have the honor of being joined by the President of Armenia, Armen Sarkisian. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. President. I want to cut right to something in the news, and that is the meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. Apparently, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict either didn't come up or came up in a very muted fashion. Does that disappoint you?
Well, it's up to the leaders of superstates. It's up to Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin to discuss whatever they consider as important today. And I would not like to comment on what they have discussed. First of all, I don't know the details of their discussion. I hope they will be focusing on both of them on the issues that are global importance, which includes also the issues related to Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict, especially in Nagorno-Karabakh. As you know, we had a war. Unfortunately, we in Armenia, we were not wise enough to be prepared for that war. The first war in Nagorno-Karabakh ended in 1994, and the Armenian side won the war against the same Azerbaijan. But then upcoming 26 years, we were not wise enough, and I'm repeating that word because it comes very natural to me, connected to your wonderful conference. That is not the first time that I'm participating. Being wise is important for any individual, for organization, for corporation, and it's being wise also important for a nation and a state. So I would definitely say that we in Armenia, we were not enough wise, and we're behind Azerbaijan, let's say several years, because this war was lost by Armenian side, not because the soldiers lost them, because they were behind Azerbaijan in technology. And unfortunately, Turkey openly supported Azerbaijan with technology and drones as well.
I want to get to that, and sorry for interrupting you, Mr. President. But do you feel that Russia has potentially hung Armenia out to dry in terms of the recent conflict?
First of all, to be honest, I don't understand the words that you used about Russia and Armenia. Russia is a strategic partner for Armenia, and it was a historic partner for Armenia for many years. And in one simple thing that we have to... Are they doing enough?
Are they doing enough, sir?
Well, they are doing as much as they think that they are doing, or is necessary to do. Because first of all, we have to speak, is Armenia itself, or Armenian nation, which is a global nation, a small state, but a global nation, are we doing enough? I think before asking United States, Russia, France, or any third country doing more for Armenia, I would say it's my duty as the President of the Republic to think how we can do more ourselves. And I can tell you, we are facing in Armenia parliamentary elections in 2 days' time. And I hope these elections will bring some sort of understanding, stability, or predictability internally in Armenia. But I hope that this will be the beginning of a new era, which I call the Fourth Republic, because the third one that we are living today has made too many mistakes, and we have to basically focusing into the future. And that future for Armenia, for a small state by a global nation, is focusing on new technology, global behavior, globalization, taking care of all Armenians living abroad, and basically using the huge potential of the Armenian diaspora, that is multi-million people living there are several million Armenians living in both United States and in Russia. And we are not using them.
Well, so let me finish a little bit with that geopolitics angle, and then I want to get to the economy. Are you looking to the United States, to President Biden, to restrain Turkey, perhaps on the back of the diaspora and the close relationship that you've had with the United States?
Well, to be honest, I would answer you in a form. We are looking for anyone that can restrain Turkey's behavior. I think we had very dramatic, tragic history with Turkey. As you know, more than 100 years ago, we had the genocide of Armenians. And this is something that this nation, which is global because of the genocide, can never forget.
And,
I think,
and
then we have.
And President Biden did recognize
let me
that.
finish.
Yeah.
Let me finish.
Sure.
Yes, I know. I know that President has recognized, and I've thanked President Biden in an official letter to him. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the nations, which includes also France, Russia, United States, that have recognized. But I think to build relations between two neighboring states is first of all, it's important that Turkey has to recognize that things were wrong. Things happened wrong 106 or more years ago in Ottoman Empire. Then we have to start building our future. I mean, as the president of this country, I would like to guide my nation and the state towards the future, remembering the past, but going to the future, going to the future technologically, economically, politically as well. And I would love that this war in Caucasus should be the last sort of a unnecessary war in Caucasus and with Armenia. We lost around 5,000 lives, more than 10,000 injured young people. And unfortunately, I'm someone that believes that the biggest weapon in human hand is the human word, i.e. is the negotiations. I think we failed negotiating, and that's a big failure. It's a big failure for the sides, which is the Armenian and Azeri side. It's also, unfortunately, a failure for international community, because every war, instead of a negotiation, is a failure. It's a loss of lives, it's a loss of, and then the creation of a new unhappy hatred and a new situation. So, well, I lived all of my life believing that both in science, technology, business, and in politics, diplomacy, I mean, the power of word is the most important. But because we were not a presidential state but parliamentary, I was not involved in negotiations with the counterpart, President Aliyev. I personally still believe that there's only one way out of every conflict, which is negotiations. Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that it's possible to get President Aliyev back to the table? Because he's said that he thinks that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is one that's best resolved by war.
Well, I think that's a question that you should ask him rather than me. I mean, I cannot comment. I cannot comment on Mr. Aliyev. I think you ask him. I can tell only on my behalf that we still have after-war issues, and that issues are. There are several hundred Armenian prisoners of war in Azerbaijan. There are none in Azeri ones in Armenia. There are issues related to those whose fate is unknown. Armenian soldiers whose fate, young people whose fate is unknown. There are issues on the border. I mean, the limitation and demarcation of the borders are issues which are important, but they will take time, and they are also very, very sensitive, especially now in Armenia, because of the political instability and the political confrontation of different political sides, be that the government or leading political party with the opposition, and so on and so forth. So all of that are issues that we have to resolve eventually, and there is one way of resolving that, to resolve it forever, and that is the human way, which is the power of word, negotiations.
Are there any specific reforms that you would like to see to improve the economic output of Armenia? I know you've said that the country should not pretend to be high-tech when it doesn't have that capability. So what would you do instead?
No, I didn't say that. Well, I said we were pretending the last 30 years that we're IT, while we had the potential of becoming the IT. We have one of the biggest potentials to be IT. But before that, I do believe that we have to change the constitution in Armenia, bring it back to presidential, because with the current constitution, which is neither parliamentary nor presidential, it's super prime ministerial, I think There are people that have huge power but no responsibility. We have to go back to presidential, start doing the reforms, and the reforms focusing to the future, bringing new technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, opening the doors for our huge diaspora, and using those who can have been educated, doing research worldwide, bringing and contributing to Armenia, both in science, technology, business, but also in politics as well. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
Yes or no, Mr. President? Would you want to stay president in that new system if it came about?
Well, you know, with this system, I have to be president another 4 years. If we change the constitution, and I'm going to
okay, fair enough.
that we have to change it, then you call me and I'll answer your question. But we have to change the constitution, and we have to bring the whole Armenian nation diaspora together to make this country safe, sound, predictable, and focusing to the future.
Mr. President, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. His Excellency, the President of Armenia, Armen Sarkisian.
Well, thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Haslinda Amin of Bloomberg Television. Now, the pandemic is causing the largest and fastest drop in global trade in recent history. It's also deepened the fragility of trade relations. Add to that technological shifts, all pointing to the complexities of doing business. Let's get insights from a titan of business, Mukesh Ambani, Chairman and Managing Director of Reliance Industry. Mr. Ambani, good to have you with us. A rare opportunity, so we thank you for your time today.
Greetings from India to all of you. And at the outset, I would like to convey my hearty congratulations on the occasion of the first Qatar Economic Forum. It's a symbol of hope and reassurance that the world is slowly coming out of the most difficult and challenging times created by the corona pandemic.
Mr. Ambani, on that note, I'm wondering, what do you think will be the legacy of this pandemic in terms of global commerce? Has it fundamentally changed the way business is done?
Well, I think that COVID is a once-in-a-century humanitarian crisis. The world was not prepared for it. The crisis tested the resilience of mankind. The world has suffered, but ultimately what will triumph is not the virus, but the human spirit. We have seen unprecedented global solidarity. The unthinkable has become possible. No one could have imagined that the world would produce a vaccine in less than a year and vaccinate the whole world in a couple of years. So I think that as humanity in both trade, commerce, and global economics, we have a lot to learn, and more of the unthinkable is going to be possible, right? Even if you take Qatar's example, right? We in India will never forget the Qatar's friendship during this crisis, right? Where it moved much beyond commerce, where they even used all their passenger aircrafts to get medicine and supplies to India in time. And what this has shown is that Qatar may be a small nation in size, but it has a very big heart. Because I think that trade along with purpose and compassion is the way forward. And that is going to get all of us as humanity together to integrate and make sure that collectively we actually deal with global problems as one and help each other moving forward. So to my mind, this for the global economy is a fork in the road and gives us an opportunity that together we can achieve a lot more.
Given that optimism, though, there are challenges. What do you view as the biggest challenges for industry chiefs at this point in time as we emerge from this pandemic?
Well, I think that the challenges first are really to make sure that we get rid of the vaccination divide, right? It is critical that bulk of the developed world, right, will be vaccinated by the end of the year. I think we in India have taken many steps, but and we expect that by the end of this year, first quarter of next year, we would do very well. But it's the whole humanity that we have to make sure that we are all in it together. The second challenge for all of us is to make sure that we bring back the economies, particularly in the more developed countries, right, which have not had the benefit of stimulus, which have not had the benefit of government money, by really supporting the whole global economy to come back and to grow, so that we are able to grow the whole world in a sustainable way and not only bring back the developed economies. And towards that, all of us in industry, governments and civil society will have to work as a coalition, not only for our own company, not only for our own country, but for the global economy collectively.
The pandemic has shown how critical it is to close that digital divide. Do you see digital services, technology for that matter, bridging the inequality gap? What's India's own experience in trying to close that gap? What are some of the key takeaways there?
Well, I think the digital divide must be bridged, both among nations and within nations. This is because connectivity and communications have become the basic needs and also fundamental rights of every human being on the planet, as basic as food, clothing, and shelter. We never realized this as acutely as we did in the corona pandemic. Even in India, our Prime Minister had given a call for Digital India, and I was privileged with our digital services company called Jio to roll out a 4G network. And we were lucky that we rolled out the network across the length and breadth of India by 2018. We have always wondered that what would we have done without a 4G network across India in facing the corona crisis. So yes, the digital infrastructure was very useful in work to home, in vaccinating all our people, in making sure that our children learned at home and learned online. And I think that this trend of digital physical, right, will be the new normal. And into the future, we will deliver, right, most of our health, education, services also in a digital physical sense. So to my mind, it's an absolute must for all economies to integrate and enhance this digital infrastructure, which has been so very useful in the corona crisis.
You talked about how Jio has helped to bridge that inequality gap. How else do you see your company being able to address the issue of inequality?
Well, I think that if we see, I would like to begin that by again learning from Qatar, right? What His Highness Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani has done is he has used the hydrocarbon wealth, right, with his vision to have Qatar as an advanced society with strong economic and social foundations. The investments in education and healthcare offer the people of Qatar, right, the most advanced infrastructure and opportunity to grow. I think that across the world and in India, we must invest in education so that there is equal opportunity for everybody. And healthcare, what this crisis has taught us is we need to urgently upgrade the healthcare infrastructure across the world to make sure that we are ready for any future crisis, because I believe that this pandemic will not be the last health crisis that humanity has seen. And it is important that we, within industry, again, within governments, all work together to make sure that the opportunity that we have to really work towards giving equal opportunity and reduce inequality across all sections of our world.
Mr. Ambani, the pandemic has also highlighted the issue of sustainability. Businesses are now increasingly under pressure to commit to sustainability. How do you view that as a business leader?
My view is that we have no option as a society, as business, to really adopt a sustainable business model to ensure that we embrace the model of clean energy is a prerequisite for our growth. And we at Reliance have adopted this wholeheartedly and are transforming each one of our business lines to be sustainable, circular, recyclable, and with fully transparent environment, social, and governance standards. And I think that's a prerequisite for every business to survive as we go forward.
Would that mean perhaps dialing back some of your businesses right now? Is that something that needs to be thought of?
It'll mean transforming our businesses and integrating that with the future.
Mr. Ambani, many people may not know that you have a special link to the Middle East. You were born in Yemen when your father was working there before moving back to India. Talk to us about this connection to the Middle East and how you see it in the context of business.
Well, I think that I was born in Yemen because my father went as a young Indian to Yemen, and he always says I have Arabic blood, which I think that we value the relationships between all the Arabic countries and India. It is a centuries-old relationship. I think that a lot of Indian population is there in Qatar, and while Qatar has lots of populations, like we have about 700,000 Indians, and each one of them is a spokesperson for Qatar in India. I also think that within my own family, right, I've had the privilege of working with Sheikh Hamad at the United Nations Millennium Development Goals Group. But my wife is a big fan of her achievements in sports and culture. And my daughter is a big fan of everything that the foundation has achieved in art. So as a family, we have great admiration for what the Qatar Foundation and the Qatari royal family has really achieved for the people of Qatar. And I only hope that we can learn, be inspired, and build a very strong relationship between India and Qatar.
Mr. Ambani, we thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Well, welcome to this session on restructuring the global economy. I'm Stephanie Flanders, Senior Executive Editor for Economics at Bloomberg, and I'm delighted to have two massive figures in the world of global finance for this session. First, the founder and co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio, and the Harvard economics professor and, of course, former US Treasury Secretary, Lawrence Summers. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Look, the title of this session talks about a new economic blueprint, and that both of you, I know, have thought deeply about what a better version of the global economy might look like over the years. But I think those watching will not forgive me if we don't start by getting into something that could be changing the economic landscape before our eyes, whether or not we like it, and that's inflation. Both of you have views on this, but maybe I'll start with you, Larry. I mean, we have a former Fed chair sitting as Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, but that doesn't seem to have made her more concerned about the inflation that we have coming down the track, and indeed can already see in the US. And despite that massive fiscal stimulus that's also here and going to continue, is there something that policymakers in Washington are missing that you're seeing when you say we should be worried more about inflation?
Arithmetic. I don't think the arithmetic is terribly difficult. We're looking at an average GDP gap relative to potential GDP of 2% this year, and we're looking at a 14% of GDP fiscal stimulus, along with massive growth in the Fed's balance sheet and very low real interest rates. Arithmetic. We're looking at labor shortages as measured by job openings or as measured by workers' comfort in quitting at record levels. Arithmetic. We're looking at a current rate of inflation that, if you look at the last 2 or 3 months, is running close to 8%. Now, no one thinks that that's the new built-in rate of inflation. So, of course, there's transient inflation. The important question is whether that is 6 percentage points of transient inflation or 4 percentage points of transient inflation. And I don't see the basis for policymakers' serenity that it's only that it's a full 6% of transient inflation. I welcomed the Fed's limited efforts to mark its views towards reality and a growing awareness that this overheating is likely to necessitate a monetary policy response. But I still think the reality of overheating, just if you look at the most basic numbers, is being overestimated. The prevailing forecast at the Fed, in the White House, indeed in much of the consensus of professional economic forecasters in February, was that we would have inflation just above 2% this year. We've already had more inflation than that in the first 5 months of the year. That would suggest to me that people should not just modify their forecasts, but should think about what their errors of thinking were that led them to be so far off in their forecasts.
So, Ray, we had there from Larry, the economist, indeed, that the mathematician's response to the situation. I mean, as an investor, we've seen that pivot of some kind by the Fed last week, quite a calm market reaction. But should investors generally be taking this threat a lot more seriously?
There are different kinds of inflation. I'm not particularly worried about the classic supply, demand pressing up against supply, although we'll find out soon, because there's something like 10% of GDP stored in financial assets that's going to be coming out. And so it's likely that there's going to be a big pickup in demand, and that will probably raise prices significantly. And it also depends how you count for inflation, because like housing prices themselves are going up a lot, but rental prices are going down a lot. The big things I think are, and if you went to a 3% inflation rate or some bounce, that's not one of those things that gets me very nervous or very excited. The real issue is that we have a supply-demand issue of bonds, because we're going to have to sell a lot of bonds. to those in the world who own bond inventories. And they have very low interest rates, negative real interest rates, and they're overweighted in US bonds, and they're going to have to buy a lot more. And that is also coming at a time when Chinese capital markets, other capital markets are becoming more attractive. That creates a supply-demand issue that can create a monetary inflation because there will not be enough demand to buy those bonds. And that means that it's likely that the Federal Reserve will not be able to taper or cut back and might actually have to increase to prevent interest rates from going up. And that's a classic monetary inflation. So that's my bigger concern than just the spurt. I think for most of the world, the real question is what are interest rates relative to inflation, and also what is happening with all this liquidity, because there's a huge amount of liquidity and negative real interest rates. And that means that it pays not to own any debt instruments, that pays not to own cash, certainly not cash, where you get no interest rate in an environment, like Larry says, of some amount of significant inflation. I think it'll be, let's say, in the vicinity of over 3%. So you get taxed at that rate in terms of buying power. And so when I look at that, I think you're going to see the continued inflation in other assets, and it pays to borrow a lot. I know, like to borrow houses right now, I mean, to buy, I'm seeing interest-only loans being made when there's basically no interest rate. In other words, you don't have to pay back your principal anytime soon. And the interest rates are so low, so there's a lot of money being thrown around that way. Those are the things that concern me more, because you build up a bubble. You saw the reaction in the markets when the Fed just even hinted at tightening. I don't think they can tighten a lot without having a big negative effect. So that's what it looks like to me, the whole picture of the low real interest rates, and then also the worries about the supply-demand, monetary inflation, and also the Fed tightening.
Well, you both focused not just on the short-term inflation, but on this long, because obviously what really matters is whether we're moving to a long-term environment which is more inflationary and the implications of that. So I guess, Larry, I would say to you, how much do you buy into the monetary side of what Ray was just saying, and also how much would you say this is a global issue, not just something that's related to US fiscal policy, for example?
Look, I would say we're driving our car at 100 miles an hour on a road that is empty right now, but won't always be empty. And I don't know what form the accident will come, but when you're driving 100 miles an hour, it's probably not actually the fastest way to get where you're going, because you're likely to have some kind of dislocation. And whether that comes in product and labor markets, whether that comes in spiking of interest rates, whether that comes first in a decline in the value of the dollar, I don't presume to be able to predict. But that we're on a problematic course where anything can happen and none of us can predict markets precisely, but where the balance of risks is very, very much on the too much liquidity overheating side seems to me to be relatively clear. I think these tendencies are present in many places, but I think they're by far more pronounced in the United States than they are in the rest of the world. It's not that extraordinarily low interest rates are unique. It's not that extraordinarily big budget deficits are unique. It's that having them in tandem with an economy that's growing at what people expect will be a double-digit rate this quarter, and along with an epic degree of labor shortage. That's what is, it seems to me, the extraordinary feature of this moment. It would be a very different thing if we were creating liquidity in an extraordinary way to respond to a major output gap. But to be doing this kind of thing in a labor shortage economy seems to me to be very intensely problematic.
You mentioned the dollar. I mean, I guess one could see there are different scenarios that come out of this. I mean, the classic scenario for the US growing faster than everybody else, sucking in a lot of imports, would be that actually the dollar could rise and export problems to the rest of the world that way. But Ray, you just mentioned that you potentially see the dollar heading down. So is there a fundamental threat to the dollar that comes out of this?
Yes. The way, I mean, I'm just dealing with the mechanics. You know, the way it works is you sell a lot of bonds. So now who do you sell the bonds to? And then when I look around and calculate who owns the bonds and what they have to buy and what the incentives of buying, they're bad. And in fact, you could see dollar selling of bonds. What that means is then the Federal Reserve is in a position of either seeing rates rise because there's not enough demand to meet that. In fact, if they start selling, it would be a very bad situation. And that they can't let that happen because that would be very bad for the economy and markets and all sorts of things. So we have to keep in mind where we are. We're at the end of a long-term debt cycle. And that means that the Federal Reserve will have to do what they did last time, which is to buy a lot more to prevent the interest rates from going up. That's very non-cyclical. It's one of those cases where, you know, in reserve currencies, it's a very dangerous thing. Now you compare that with alternatives. First, the best alternatives are other asset classes, but also let's say China, for example. I think the situation that we're in is quite similar to the going from the late 60s into the early 70s, when there was a different core inflation rate in the United States versus Germany and Japan. It's a different balance of payments situation. We're in basically a balance of payments deficit. They're in a balance of payments surplus position. That means that they chronologically are worried about imported inflation, and there's favorable capital flows. So I think that that's negative for the dollar, particularly against Asian currencies.
Now, Larry,
I have Ray's instincts, but considerable agnosticism on timing. There are classic periods, the early 1980s is the one that comes to mind, where large budget deficits spurred growth, sucked in capital, and were associated with an appreciation of the dollar. So I'm not sure of the timing here, but I think, and I'm not as confident as Ray is in the long-term attractiveness of Chinese capital markets and indeed of foreign capital markets to the dollar. But I think the risks are substantial. And one of the things that I hear people say that seems most bizarre to me is they say, no, you don't understand. Now we're in an era of globalization. And so the inflation process is much stickier, or we can't get rapid inflation because of globalization. I think the opposite. Because of globalization, we're much more like a small country than we used to be. And that means that the dollar gets into trouble, which it easily could, that the pass-through to inflation is going to be more rapid than it would have been decades ago. So I basically share the kind of concern that Ray is expressing, just with a bit more uncertainty about timing. And I guess I'd add one more thing, Stephanie, and I think it's kind of an important point, and it's implicit in something that Ray said. The really hard monetary policy challenges are not actually moments like the period after Lehman or the period a year ago this spring, when there's massive illiquidity and markets are breaking down, and it's entirely obvious the direction that policy should move. You need to provide liquidity, and the questions have to do with how. The really hard monetary policy dilemmas are when it's not clear which way to go. When on the one hand, you have a falling currency and an excess supply of bonds, and on the other hand, you have a weakening economy and rising inequality and a fear of recession, and you don't know whether you're cutting rates to respond to the latter problem or doing tightening things to respond to the former problem. Those are the really difficult moments in monetary policy where even the direction is not entirely clear. And my fear is that we're setting ourselves up for such a moment.
I think that the Fed, though, would argue that they are actively looking to have that overshoot in inflation, the change of approach in terms of the average inflation model, in order to sort of reset the system and indeed get that wage growth through to parts of the economy that perhaps have not seen it over the last few years, and that could be more politically sustainable long term. So Ray, do you see that is an argument that the Fed could make, that it's worth some short-term risk to achieve that more sustainable outcome?
As I mentioned, I think if you see break-even inflation rates go above 3% or something like that, and you see that spurt, then you have the dilemma of the tightening of the monetary policy. As I said, I'm not particularly worried about that particular inflation. The other things that worry about me are the whole shift in terms of the quantity of debt money that's being produced that goes into create bubbles, creates an enormous amount of liquidity, and that I think will be manifest by either a rate rise tracing inflation or dollar decline. And I think then we also have to deal with the changes in the political situation, the wealth gap situation. With the wealth gap is the left-right question. There's a lot of conflict in terms of left-right politics. There's a big move, pretty much probably, to more left politics, believing that there's not enough fair share of incomes and so on. And those will create structural changes that will have effects. The amount of money which has gone to profits has increased from about 6% of revenue to about 14% of revenue. And that's decreased the share that's gone to incomes. Those things could be structural changes that shift the wealth and income. I think we're here to those that are going to be more beneficial, let's say, to workers than to capitalists, I think, in general. That's particularly a U.S. issue. It is a European issue, too, although it's a world issue, but it differs around the world. So I think those are the bigger issues, that and the rise of China and what the rise of China means. Those, I think, are the bigger issues.
Larry, I mean, when you say the globalization, it's an interesting point about with us becoming more like a single country responding to things. But one could argue that the things that globalization was associated structurally with falling inflation for a long time, at a period where you also had central banks focusing more on inflation, and you had this sort of shift in bargaining power away from workers. If all of those things are going into reverse, that is potentially more inflationary, but also a better world for workers, or a more inclusive world, more sustainable politically?
Let me take your question a moment ago and then come to that, Stephanie. Look, I think the arguments about average inflation targeting and so forth, they kind of have their place, but I think we need to recognize when you declare victory. When we've got a record labor shortage, the Fed probably shouldn't be obsessing about making sure there are opportunities available. When we've now got average inflation over the last 2 or 3 years up to 2%. We don't have the problem of needing more inflation in order to get to some kind of level of average. So I just think we need to recognize the new reality is very different from the secular stagnation reality of 2 years ago. Look, I am all for a strengthening on a variety of dimensions of the hand of workers. I think we need to raise the minimum wage. I think we need to re-empower the ability to organize unions. I think that you can't read the stories about working conditions at Amazon and not think that something should be happening to rebalance things. At the same time, I think you have to recognize that doing all of those things is going to bear on the inflation process. It's going to bear on what economists call the natural rate of unemployment. And you're going to have it have a set of consequences, and you need to factor those in setting macroeconomic policy. I mean, we had a moment very much like the current moment, coming after a long period of no inflation. We had a government that had very expansive desires for what it was going to do. We had a progressive tide sweeping through the country, changing attitudes on very many fronts. We had that in the 1960s. And what we saw was that inflation rose more rapidly than anybody anticipated, that a right-wing tide in politics was ushered in with the successive elections with lags of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and that what happened ultimately did not serve the interests of the progressives who supported it. And you saw a big upsurge with the way in which the United States went off gold and imposed tariffs universally 50 years ago this summer. So a return to that does not seem to me to be what we should be targeting. And my concern is that I see too much in the current trajectory of economic policy. The Lyndon Johnson, John Connolly axis of economic policy making doesn't seem to me to be a healthy guide.
Well,
I think
we lost out Larry briefly, but yeah, Ray.
I think Larry and I agree that this is looking more like the late 60s transitioning to the early 70s. And then I'll also say, though, and that has implications for the balance payments in the dollar. So we've covered that. I'm more worried about the inflation in financial assets and what that means for returns and bubbles that are developing, because there's a massive amount of liquidity around, and it's being thrown around so that it's a difficult environment for those returns to be justified. I think we're building kind of a bubble. So I think inflation in financial assets and so on is an issue related to liquidity. Anyway, you think about it, what's happened is the net worth of Americans and most people in developed countries is higher than it's ever been. I mean, all of a sudden, it was a big boost to net income, but yet production isn't. So what you've seen is a lot of people got a lot of money, which they're still holding, and they put it into the stock market and everything, and interest rates go down and they borrow, and that is a dynamic that creates a bubble, and that's what I would say is the main issue.
Just briefly on China, Ray, just to come back to you. I mean, I know that you, sorry, Larry, do you want to jump in?
Let me just say that there's some division of labor on this panel, and Ray has talked more about financial assets, but I share his concern about asset price inflation. And I would say the idea that lower returns have led to higher asset prices, and of course, while that transition is taking place, everybody's enjoying wonderful capital gains. There's been a tendency for people like me and Ray to warn for some years now that long-term returns are going to be lower on assets. And we've been saying that for some years, and people who've been in asset markets have done very, very well, because even lower, even higher capitalization ratios, price earnings ratios, asset price to rent ratios have been taking place. And I suppose some people are probably concluding that the warnings are unwarranted as a consequence of that. Nobody knows for sure, but my feeling would be that the warnings are now even more valid, because the conditions precedent that are the basis for the warnings have become even more true with the passage of time.
So
I'm just saying the mechanics. When you have the liquidity and you drive down real rates and you drive asset prices up, that doesn't mean they come down. It just means liquidity drives those for their particular future returns.
We're going to run out of time, so I want to make sure that we can end on a sort of action point. I mean, both of you you come at it from different perspectives. You may put different shades on it, but you clearly think that there's some potential bumps coming down the road or risks that we need to be much more concerned about. Given where we are, in case of Larry, I know you wish that stimulus in the US had been spent on different things at the beginning of the year that might actually support the supply side of the US economy. And other things, the mistakes, if you like, have already been made in your view. But what's the best response, if assuming that the Fed and indeed other policymakers accept your analysis? What's the most constructive response now that wouldn't itself cause a lot of volatility and upset? Larry first, I guess.
Necessary responses probably will, in the short run, cause some volatility and upset. But I'd like to see signals that overheating, liquidity, and bubbles are now seen as major risks facing the American economy. And I'd like to see a program of structural improvement for the supply side that is fully paid for by tax increases as the response, and a reduction in the amount of populist transferring of cash to large groups in the economy.
Ray, assuming they get it, what's the best thing they can do?
I think we know that probably Larry and I agree on, just saying it very simply. There's a ton of money around and the value of money goes down. And how much it goes down relative to goods and services and how much it goes down to financial assets, it's going to go down to both. And that really raises financial assets and it changes capital flows in important ways. I think that it's easy to say that the Fed should tighten, and I think that they should. They put on the brakes a little bit. But I think you'll see a very sensitive market and a very sensitive economy, because the duration of assets has gone very, very long. And just the slightest touching on those brakes has the effect of hurting markets because of where they're priced, and also passing through to the economy. We have to keep in mind, since the cyclical peak in 1980-81, every cyclical peak in interest rates and every cyclical trough has gone steadily below the one before it until we've hit zero. And then every quantitative easing, in other words, purchasing of money, buying of money and purchasing of bonds, has been greater than the one before it. That is a debasement of the value of the currency in one way or another. So I think the challenge of the Fed is going to be able to balance those in a highly political sensitive environment because of this wealth clash. So it's a difficult position for the Fed, I think.
Well, that's two perspectives we've had on what leadership in a post-pandemic world looks like, and I know we've focused a lot on this as financial piece, but it clearly has huge global implications as well as implications for the path the U.S. economy is on for the next few years. So thank you very much to both of you, Ray Dalio and Lawrence Summers. We appreciate you joining us. Thanks to all listeners.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm David Weston from Bloomberg, and it's my great pleasure now to welcome the former Secretary of the Treasury. He is Steven Mnuchin. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. You were the steward for the U.S. economy for 4 years under President Trump. Give us your read right now on where the U.S. economy is, and for that matter, the global economy. Are we fully rebounding from that substantial downturn as a result of the pandemic?
Well, let me just put this in perspective and first say I'm very proud of the work we did with Congress last year, passing very strong bipartisan legislation. The CARES Act passed 96 to 0 and 100 to 0. And had we not done that and worked closely with the Fed, I think we would have had a global depression, not recession. Now with the advent of vaccines being distributed and at large scale and a better understanding of the disease, I think you're seeing the economies opening up, and you're going to see very, very strong growth rates, particularly in the U.S., but also in other areas of the world.
What risks are there to that projection in your view? And let me name one specifically here in the United States. That's the labor markets. We seem to be having a very difficult time matching up the people looking for jobs who have lost jobs through the pandemic with the jobs that are remaining open, because the JOLTS numbers, as you know, are very, very high, record highs.
Well, there's no question that there are areas of the economy, particularly in hospitality and travel, where they now are reopening and they're having a difficult time hiring people. I believe part of the impact, not the entire impact, but a significant part of the impact, are the programs that we put in place during the pandemic were intended when the economy was closed. And now as the economy opens up, we need to see those various different programs roll off. I think the other area we're seeing is we need better job training. There's areas where there's more people looking for jobs and not necessarily the right training in those areas. So I think those are two areas we need to focus on tremendously.
There's a great deal of talk, as you know, Mr. Secretary, with the so-called K-shaped recovery, that some people are doing very, very well, much better than they were. Some people are really being left behind. Does that pose potentially a risk for the overall growth of the economy, quite apart from some of the distributional issues and maybe moral issues?
Well, it clearly does. I mean, you see this both within the U.S. economy. There are certain companies, such as online retailers, that had record years, even through the pandemic. There's other companies, such as travel and leisure, that were completely shut down and had to take on excessive debt. So I think you see that both within the U.S. and then more broadly, you see the richer economies performing better as they had large fiscal response and vaccine distribution, and the poorer countries having more difficult issues. And that's something we'll all need to help on.
Mr. Secretary, one of the things that you focused on as Secretary of Treasury, as well as President Trump focused on, was the trend line for growth. You were concerned that it had really fallen down to 2% and even south of 2%. You got it under the Trump administration up close to 3%, although it was coming back down even before the pandemic. Where do you see the trend line right now for U.S. economic growth in light of the pandemic? Does the pandemic change that trend line up or down?
Well, I think the economic programs that we put in, which were a combination of the Tax Act, regulatory, and trade deals, really helped the economy grow. I think now one of the issues is there's a lot of uncertainty in the United States around what's going to happen in tax, what's going to happen in infrastructure. So
I would encourage the leaders to work on a bipartisan basis to pass additional legislation and take those risks out of the economy so that people know how the economy is going to react and what the different regulatory and tax policies will be, which clearly will impact different businesses significantly.
So let's take those as you raise them. Infrastructure and tax. Infrastructure first. As you know, there's a negotiations going on right now in Washington to see if the bipartisan approach can be delivered. What do you think is the right answer for infrastructure at this point for the United States?
Well, I think infrastructure is something that's very important. Actually, this is something that President Trump campaigned on as well, and we wanted to get done. We ended up having a lot of other priorities, so we had difficulty passing this. But just as last year, both parties came together to pass the CARES Act, I would encourage the parties to come together, something that looks like around $1 trillion, as I know what the bipartisan group has been working on. And I think that can have a real positive impact on the economy. So I'm a big fan of bipartisan work in that area. And I would be very careful, particularly as we grow the economy and people are trying to get back to work and small businesses are opening up, what could be significant tax increases across the board.
Well, and the tax increases really is the rub, isn't it? Because watching from the outside, at least, with the various meetings that President Trump had up at the White House, the infrastructure weeks that were had, it always got down to, I think, how do you pay for it? Not just how big is it, but how do you pay for it? Is it essential that you not raise income taxes in any way, shape, or form, corporate or individual, in order to make the infrastructure work?
I think it can be done. There's a lot of money left from the pandemic funds last year. We passed over $6 trillion of funds. There's still significant money that hasn't been used. I believe that can be recycled. And I think the bipartisan group can look for, across the board, there may be some pay-fors that don't have significant impact on the economy.
Is that use taxes?
Excuse me?
Would that be use taxes, for example? That's one of the things being suggested is pay for. That's not income tax, but a use tax.
I'm not going to comment on the specifics of whether it's gas taxes or other, because I'm going to let the bipartisan group figure that out. Almost by definition, it's the areas that people can agree on. But I'm hopeful that will get done. I think it's been moving in the right direction, and I'm hopeful.
So, Mr. Secretary, give us, if you can, a rough sensitivity analysis on the question of the trend line growth, because you said it depends critically on investment in things like infrastructure and tax policy, which seem to be linked up. What's the upper level? What's the lower level, depending on what they do there? What do you expect in terms of trend line growth for the United States over the next 5 years?
Well, I can't comment on 5 years, but I would say clearly in the foreseeable future, I mean, we could easily see 6 to 8% growth. I think the other area, and the previous panel commented on this, is the risk of inflation and how that plays out. Now, inflation is good for certain parts of the economy and very bad for other parts of the economy. So I do worry, as Larry Summers and others have said, that the chances are higher as opposed to lower, that this is ongoing inflation and that the Fed will need to adjust for that. I think in the interim, there'll be businesses that are growth businesses, high margin businesses with consumer spending that will do very well with higher inflation, and businesses with lower margins and high costs of labor are going to be concerned. So I think the inflation outlook is something that's going to need to be managed very carefully.
Well, let's talk about managing it carefully, because it appears that the Fed is coming around to the view that at least has to be concerned about inflation. That's what we heard from the Fed after the FOMC meeting. We heard Chair Jay Powell say we're paying attention now to inflation, even though they didn't take specific action. Do you think that what the Fed is doing, basically in indicating down the road they're going to have to tighten some, do you think that that's going to be enough to rein in the danger of inflation?
Well, I have a lot of confidence in Chair Powell. And we worked obviously very closely over the last several years. Clearly, what the Fed did last year during the pandemic really, really helped, and it was critical. So there's no question that the Fed needs to go into a period of normalizing rates and normalizing the portfolio. And I think the question is really how quickly they do that and how they do that in an effort to control inflation. I think the issue is that the Fed is being cautious. The Fed models, the Treasury models, economic models really are not very good at predicting, given the vast amount of fiscal and monetary response we had over the last year. So I think this is something that needs to be watched very carefully. And I do think the markets are underestimating this risk.
Well, it does raise the broader question, at least for me, of how much of the growth we're seeing right now, because as you say, Mr. Secretary, we're going to see some robust growth this year in all likelihood. How much of that is because of the fiscal and monetary support as opposed to the underlying strength of the economy?
Well, I think a large part of that is going to be the fiscal and monetary that allowed for the reopening of the economy. So again, I just want to put this in perspective. Over a year ago, I never thought I'd be in a period of time sitting in an Oval Office talking about shutting down travel to Europe, talking about shutting down the entire economy. So there's no question that now that it's reopened, and now that, at least in the US, there's vast vaccine distribution, you're seeing businesses come back very, very strong. And I believe in particular the travel, entertainment, leisure business. People like these videos, but people want to get back out and travel and see people.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. You talked about some of the things that you did in the Trump administration, you and President Trump did, to really spur growth. And it certainly included tax cuts as well as regulatory reform. On the other hand, President Trump from the beginning took a very strong line with China, which, by the way, President Biden seems to be following up on. Looking back at it now, did you leave some growth on the table because of the need to be tough on China?
Well, I can't specifically say whether we did or whether we didn't. What I will say is that China is the second largest economy in the world. It has a large population, 1.3 billion. It's both the biggest opportunity and the biggest threat, with a large growing middle class. And the purpose of the tariffs were really to create a level playing field. So the issues that we were dealing with were the same issues that my predecessors were dealing with, Hank Paulson and others. And there's no question that the tariffs had the desired impact of getting China to the negotiating table. We made a lot of progress on the phase one trade deal. I would encourage the Biden administration to continue that work and try to have China make more reforms on trade and play by the global rules. I think that's important for their economy and very important for the rest of the world economy as well.
As the Biden administration does apparently turn from Europe to Asia, and particularly China, is it a zero-sum game? I mean, in the sense that in order to really get China to the bargaining table and get real concessions, you have to run the risk of giving up some growth.
Well, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. China, they were at the bargaining table. We made significant progress. I would encourage people to get back to the bargaining table, and let's see if they can get a phase two deal done. That's really the purpose. This was about protecting intellectual property, protecting fair and free trade, and having two-way trade. A major component, we believed, of the deficit was that our companies didn't have the same opportunities to participate in China as their companies had in the U.S.
And finally, Mr. Secretary, I really want to turn to what you're doing now, because I understand you were putting together a fund for investment that involves sort of, if I can put it this way, a public-private partnership in a sense, public-government experience with private investment. Tell me what you're doing.
Well, David, I'm very focused on the work that I did over the last 4 years, both on national security and regulatory areas, very focused on technology such as cybersecurity and data privacy. I think, as we've seen in recent events, these are very important areas of national security and economic security, and also in fintech and financials, where we see really the U.S. systems continuing to advance significantly.
So some of the issues we've seen, for example, with some of the ransomware attacks, are real challenges. Do you see investment opportunities there, and what do those investment opportunities look like?
Well, David, when I was at Treasury, I was responsible for cybersecurity for all of the financial services industry, as well as for the IRS, which is obviously a very large holder. And we did a lot of work on modernization. We did a lot of preparation. The financial services industry has invested significant amounts of money in these areas. I think other areas of the U.S. economy need to continue to invest as well. And this is going to be an ongoing issue that's not a 1 or 2 year issue, but in my opinion, a 10-year issue.
Let me ask you something that I know you know a lot about, and that's blockchain, and for that matter, cryptocurrency. Is that a help or a hindrance in dealing with some of the security issues we have?
Well, I think the underlying technology of blockchain has huge potential, particularly for things like real-time payment processing, cross-border, using stable coins. My views, and we did a lot of work at Treasury on this on an interagency basis. We put out regulations last year around making sure that if you want to buy cryptocurrencies, that it has to be transparent. And I believe that many of those industries should be in the regulated world. They should follow the same BSA, the Bank Secrecy Act requirements, know your customer requirements, and these shouldn't be the equivalent of secret Swiss numbered bank accounts. So as long as we do a lot of work, and that was being done at the G7 and G20 as well, I think the idea is to make sure we crack down on financial terrorism so it can't be used for ransom attacks and other illicit activities.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, in a word or two, should we have a central bank digital currency? I know China's working on one.
Well, I think that's something that the Fed is looking at. I know at least when I was there, both the Treasury and the Fed hadn't made any long-term decisions. I think it's a complicated issue, but I don't think it's a short-term issue. So I encourage the Fed to continue to look at these issues so that they have those capabilities. The more important issue is probably the real-time payment processing systems that both private industry as well as the Fed are working on right now.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, I can't thank you enough for being with us. Real pleasure to talk to you. That's Steven Mnuchin, former Treasury Secretary.
Vaccine apartheid is dominating the current global debate. We want to hear from you about it. Throughout the 3 days of the forum, we're going to be polling you on all the topics that we're discussing here. So for now, here's our question. Is it discriminatory for businesses to require their customers to be vaccinated for COVID-19? A, no, it's the only way we'll get the pandemic under control. B, yes, there isn't equitable access to vaccines globally. And C, either a negative COVID-19 test or vaccine should be sufficient. Let's take you to a website and see how everybody there is participating and polling. We're getting these results come in real time. So let's take a look and see what the results are. It looks like A is leading here at about between 47 to 50%. It's the only way that we will get the pandemic under control. It looks like people are a little bit split here. We have a number of participants and 40, well, actually it looks more like a tie between A and C. There seems to be a relatively equal split between A and C. A being the only way we'll get the pandemic under control is to require vaccinations, or the other half of you think that either a negative COVID-19 test or vaccine should be sufficient. And that's really the core of the debate, isn't it? And a big part of this, too, is about vaccine equity, because developed nations have gobbled up more than half of all available vaccines, and poor countries and regions are crying foul. People in the richest countries and regions are getting vaccinated more than 30 times faster than those with the lowest incomes.
We've seen that some countries, they purchase enough doses to vaccinate their populations 3 times over.
The World Health Organization says just 10 countries have received 75% of all vaccines administered so far. Only 0.3% have gone to lower income nations.
The world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure.
The dramatic surge in COVID-19 infections and deaths in India, Southeast Asia, and Latin America paint a grim picture. Africa is in particular trouble. The continent has received only 1% of available vaccines. Africa is largely dependent on supplies from India, which has suspended its vaccine exports.
We've had to dedicate a lot of our capacity, which was not originally planned for India, now is going to the Indian citizens. We're trying to balance it out as much as possible.
Africa is exploring new options to protect its 1.2 billion people.
The Mastercard Foundation will deploy $1.3 billion over the next 3 years in partnership with the Africa CDC to save lives and livelihoods of millions of people.
Production globally needs to be ramped up and made more affordable. In the meantime, some rich countries have agreed to share their supplies with the WHO's COVAX initiative. COVAX was set up to distribute vaccines to the world's poorest countries.
This means over the next 6 weeks, the United States of America will send 80 million doses overseas.
And in a move toward vaccine equity, the World Trade Organization has proposed waiving intellectual property rights of vaccine production.
So my job is to make sure that I bring members together to actually sit down and negotiate text.
It's supported by the US, India, South Africa, and developing nations, but the European Union and pharmaceutical companies are firmly opposing the move. If left unaddressed, extreme poverty will rise for the first time in 20 years.
Vaccine nationalism is an economic as well as a moral failure. And the latest research by the International Chamber of Commerce shows that without support to the developing world, this crisis could cost the global economy up to $9.2 trillion US.
Your Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until recently, Africa had not yet seen the same scale of devastation from the COVID-19 pandemic as some other regions. But Africa now appears to be facing a steep increase in cases and deaths, and it's facing it without vaccines. With the support of COVAX, 52 countries in Africa have now started vaccinating. But so far, only 40 million doses of vaccine have been administered in Africa, or less than 2% of Africa's population. To end the pandemic, WHO's target is to support every country to vaccinate at least 10% of its population by September, at least 40% by the end of the year, and at least 70% by June next year. WHO and our partners are working day and night to secure access to more doses and scale up production to meet these targets. But it's clear that in a crisis, Africa cannot rely solely on imports of vaccines from the rest of the world. We must build that capacity, not only for COVID-19 vaccines, but for other vaccines and medical products. With the continued support of Qatar, we can build a healthier, safer, fairer future for the people of Africa and the people of the world. I thank you. Shukran jazilan.
Joining me now is Rita Roy, President and CEO of Mastercard Foundation, and Dr. John Nkengasong, the Director of Africa CDC. Thank you both so much for joining us today. This is a wonderful partnership, a very important one for the African continent. I'd like to start by asking you, Rita, about this incredible announcement that Mastercard Foundation recently made, a $1.3 billion partnership to advance vaccine equity and strengthen the health systems of Africa. Why did you decide to do this?
Largely was inspired because of the great inequities which we see between Africa and the rest of the world. As you know, less than 2% of the African population has been vaccinated, while in comparison to more than 50% in other parts of the world. So this initiative, Saving Lives and Livelihoods, has four major priorities. First, to purchase at least vaccines for at least 50 million people, to get behind the deployment of vaccinations for millions more across the continent. Third is to build a human capital for vaccine manufacturing in Africa. And fourth, of course, to build the institutions, particularly the Africa CDC, as it mounts this historic vaccination campaign.
John, how will this change the game for the continent? And how are you intending to overcome some of the logistical barriers that you're very familiar with in Africa?
I think the partnership with the Mastercard Foundation has the potential to increase the speed at which we vaccinate on the continent and the scale. In order to win this battle against the COVID-19, you need those two to all happen simultaneously. This potential capabilities is really going to be critical if we have to win the battle against COVID-19. And secondly is the institutional development component of this that is extremely important. We did not fight and win battles against a disease pandemic without strong institutions. And Africa CDC will benefit from this partnership by strengthening its core capacities and competencies.
What are some of the core capacities and competencies, Rita, does Mastercard Foundation need to see happen and also need to focus on itself in order to make this a success?
Well, as you know, Zain, our main area of work at the Mastercard Foundation is really driving opportunities for young people, largely job creation. And we launched a strategy called Young Africa Works, which set out an ambitious goal of 30 million young people in dignified and fulfilling work by 2030. It's extremely difficult to move ahead unless we can also get this pandemic under control and really address some pretty fundamental disparities. So when I think of core capacities, I think about education for young people. I think about job creation, skills and job creation. And so this initiative, while it is extremely important in terms of driving forward vaccinations, keeping people safe, enabling all of us to get back to the work of economic recovery, in the process, it will also create work, create jobs for thousands upon thousands of people. It takes a lot of people to drive that kind of vaccination rollout across the continent, and longer term, more strategically, who will be involved in the manufacturing of vaccines, not just within facilities, but across the entire value chain of what needs to occur. So we are very, very excited, we're optimistic, but we also want to get to work.
And the human capital piece is absolutely critical, as you say, Rita. John, beyond human capital, what else is needed to make sure that continental vaccine manufacturing is a success? Like, just paint the picture for us on the continent.
No, as Rita said, we need to look at the entire value chain for vaccine manufacturing. That is from the research and development to production to manufacturing. And I think that is very important. Now, with respect to the production and manufacturing, we need strong partnership for technology transfer. Beyond human capital, we need to have the appropriate technology. Some countries in Africa already have some of these capacity and technologies, like in Senegal, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, but we need to scale that up and build trusting partnership with the developed world so that they can transfer this technology into those facilities that already have and at least get them to speed so that they can start producing the vaccines that we need now and then prepare for the future. Because we know, as we've said all along, that we know we're fighting this pandemic, but there will be another pandemic in future. So we need to transfer the technology, not just for COVID-19 vaccine development, but for other threats that we face almost on a daily basis on the continent.
And John, those are some of the big picture issues that you have to grapple with. But if I could ask you just to be a bit more granular, now that this really incredible announcement has been made, what are some of the practical things that you're thinking about and doing on a daily basis to find a starting point to roll this out and make it happen?
I think there are a couple of things that we must do and do it quickly with this partnership. One is to secure the vaccine doses, which, as you heard Rita mention, as a continent, we have immunized about 0.8% of our population fully. That is people who have received their complete doses there. So we have to access vaccines there. The second thing we must do, and do it quickly, is to support countries to be able to use the vaccines. That is, build whole supply chains. Search capacity for vaccination is critical. So we need to develop and harness the vaccinators so that they are ready to deploy those vaccines once they are available. We need to be able to strengthen vaccination centers so that people come into a clinic or an open space and be able to receive the vaccines in a timely fashion while respecting infection prevention, control, safe distances. Those are very specific things that this partnership will enable us to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Rita, one thing that I was wondering is that why did Mastercard Foundation choose Africa CDC? You could easily have done this or invested in or worked together with COVAX, for instance. Why Africa CDC?
So the Mastercard Foundation has been working in Africa for over a decade, and we have a long-standing commitment that at least 75% of our partners will be African organizations. I think that's extremely critical for long-term sustainability because no one has the same level of investment and stake in outcomes as do people who live close to the problem or people from the continent. So that's number one. I must say that we laud the efforts of all organizations, of governments, of foundations, of funders, of COVAX, because this is an effort which requires everyone's input, everyone's leadership. We had a terrific experience working with Africa CDC early on in the pandemic when we came together in a partnership to do two things. One was to really access, purchase, and then distribute rapid tests, PCR tests across the continent, as well as to train healthcare workers at that point in time in testing and tracing. And that partnership demonstrated to us that Africa CDC, under John's leadership and the capable staff that are there, are an organization which is really all about getting things done and really focused on delivery. So we were really, really thrilled, and we are grateful that we can have this partnership with Africa CDC.
And with the partnership, John, what do you see, sort of looking far down the line, as the future of Africa's overall pandemic preparedness? Because this is something that is going to lay the groundwork for, things to come that will give you the muscle and the support to do what the continent needs and lead it. So just talk a little bit about the preparedness now and where you hope to be.
So in essence, you want us to talk about preparedness for the future and for future pandemics, which is essentially what we as Africa CDC and the African Union are saying. As a continent, we need a new public health order. A new public health order that will facilitate us to strengthen and enhance our ability to manufacture not just vaccines, but diagnostics and the pharmaceutical area. We need a new public health order that will enable us to scale up our workforce, public health workforce skills, so that we can develop new skill sets for epidemiologists, what we call frontline responders. A new public health order that will allow us to develop a national network and regional networks of national public health institutes and build relationships with the private sector. If we do those four things, then we are preparing ourselves to fight this pandemic, which is terribly unpredictable and is terribly uncertain where we are heading to, but it will enable us to be able to be well equipped to respond to subsequent outbreaks and pandemics.
Rita, your leadership and your vision at the Mastercard Foundation is quite admired on the continent. You're one of the more effective foundations on the ground. Could you tell us a little bit about your approach to social enterprise and partnerships on the continent that I believe is quite different to some of the other organizations coming in and trying to operate in Africa? I think it's important to articulate the approach and why it's actually been working on the continent.
Thank you so much for that question, Zane. I think I'll just start by saying that any organization seeking to do work in a part of the world needs to, the first thing we need to do is listen, ask some questions, but really listen and seek to understand. And where possible, get as close as possible to problems people live with. See them firsthand, listen to the people we seek to work with or seek to serve, what their ideas are, how would they solve the problem if they had the means to solve the problem. So that's number one. I think second is really working in partnership. And by partnership, I mean really collaborating, not coming in and assuming that we have the answers just because we have resources. Resources can only go so far unless they are viable solutions. And so that partnership which takes on board respect for the other, understanding their views, incorporating ideas in solutions. That's been part and parcel of how we've tried to work over this past decade with some success. And that's part of the journey moving forward for us. The other critical piece is we transformed ourselves as a foundation when we announced Young Africa Works and started rolling it out. We were based largely in Toronto, in Canada. And through this partnership, working on Young Africa Works, we opened up offices across the continent. We hired wonderful staff, and we relocated our senior leadership to be based here on the continent, including myself. So that's been part of our journey, part of our learning, and it's been extremely rewarding and certainly very, very enlightening.
And speaking of trying to get greater understanding, I'd like to ask John. John, you're Africa's Dr. Fauci, right? And I would like you to explain to all of us, what are some of the things that you have to think about when you wake up every day on a continent of 55 countries, different situations with vaccines, operating unilaterally and in groups and with the African Union? And what are some of the things that worry you most every day when you look at what's happening on the continent?
I mean, there are a couple of things that gets us awake all night, and the following morning, where you go to your emergency operations center, you are looking at the numbers. Which direction are your numbers heading? Are they going down or they are going up? And if they are going up, in which countries are they going up? And then if they are going up in a certain countries, can they fight it? And what must you do? So in other words, where are the hot spots that you must deploy people very quickly so that they can work with that, they support the government of that country to squash it before it becomes another catastrophe. So I think those are the kind of things that you are watching and tracking every day when you start up your morning with your emergency operations center staff, tracking the numbers, the figures, where it is seeding, the virus is seeding itself. Then you're also looking at countries that are vaccinating. Where are they using their vaccines with speed? Are they organized? Where can you help them to support them so that they can put needles into the arms as much as possible? So those are the kind of things that we look at every day when we start our emergency operations center.
John, thank you so much. We don't know when you sleep because you're always out there, you're always on the front lines, working so hard for the continent. Thank you so much, Dr. John Nkengasong, Director of Africa CDC, and Rita Roy, President and CEO of Mastercard Foundation. And congratulations to you both on this outstanding and important partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Sherian and I'm an anchor at Bloomberg Television. I'm joined now by Nubar Afeyan, founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering and co-founder and chairman of Mrna. Nubar, it's good to see you again.
Good to be here.
So the pandemic has really shown the critical nature of health security, right? Not only to individuals, but to entire societies and economies. How much confidence does the vaccine response give you that the world is ready for another pandemic?
Well, I think that we're just beginning to get ready for the existing pandemic. I'm not sure that we can express a lot of confidence for a new pandemic, and that'll all depend on what we do going forward. And it's really too early to tell whether we've even understood the lessons of the current one, let alone have the political will to continue to do the right set of things, such as collaborations and forethought and planning and communication. There's a lot of things that need to be done. So I'd say my confidence in dealing with the current pandemic is increasing. My confidence about the next pandemic is awaiting important decisions and commitments.
The world did go down an unconventional path when it comes to vaccine development, right? Whether it's breakneck speed or just facing the risks of deploying untested technologies as well. How do you expect this to impact the traditional pharma R&D?
Well, let me provide a little bit of context for this, because when we say quote untested technologies, I think that in the rush of the last year, a lot of things were kind of discovered for the first time, and they were thought to be something that was happening out of the blue. In the case of Mrna, which is a company that we had the great privilege of being founders of 10 years ago, we've spent the last 10 years developing a platform, a set of hundreds of patents and IP, manufacturing capabilities. And before this nasty virus, SARS-CoV-2, ever showed itself to the conscience of humans, we had 9 vaccines that had been tested in humans, all showing neutralizing antibodies, and another half a dozen therapeutics, protein therapeutics, whether it's in vaccines or cardiovascular disease. So it is, in fact, a new application of a relatively new technology, but I wouldn't say it hadn't been tested. Now, it had not been tested in hundreds of millions or billions of people. And of course, there's very few pharmaceutical or vaccine technologies that have. And so when it came to going after this, the main reason why mRNA was deployed was that in the prior years leading up to that, all the data pointed to the fact that this was a completely different, in terms of speed, predictability, robustness, scalability, a different platform than we had previously. And so we were glad to be able to put it to use to really combat this virus.
So when it comes to putting it in actual use, how important were partnerships either with the public or the private sector in actually making this come together?
Extremely useful. Vital, wouldn't have happened without partnerships. And I don't just say that in the loose sense of partnerships. Partnerships are always good, but in this case, they were essential. And let me tell you just how many different partnerships and of different kinds had to be there. First of all, the NIH. We had a prior partnership with the NIH working on MERS, working on other mRNA vaccine technology with the NIAID, the very specific group that Dr. Fauci is in charge of. And they had familiarity in their own hands of what mRNA could do. And that's why they were excited to be the first to enter into human trials with our technology for the COVID-19. Again, we'd done it before with other vaccines. Then partnerships that allowed us to scale up manufacturing, most notably with Lonza, one of the largest global contract manufacturers of pharmaceuticals. But for their partnership, experience, rapid ability to deploy capabilities, even though we had to transfer technology and work with them, that would have been impossible to scale, even to the up to billion doses that we're aiming for in 2021. That would have been a fraction of that number had we not done that. The US government, in many forms, BARDA, DARPA, prior to that, we had worked with already. That meant there were trusting relationships that were put to the test in moving literally overnight. New partnerships were formed with CEPI, most recently with the whole COVAX initiative. And of course, OWS, Operation Warp Speed, that was literally put into existence in order to eliminate the barriers to collaboration and partnership, provided a very strong signal that the US government wanted vaccines to be developed of many types with backup plans. And again, I cannot, as a private citizen, having nothing to do with politics, I cannot fathom what happened last year had all of that, each and every one of those things, not been in place, and many more I didn't mention.
Given everything that you're talking about right now, did it surprise you that we continue to see these tensions and competition between nations when it comes to acquiring supplies of the shots?
Well, given the relative disorganized state that the world found itself in when this virus decided to attack one of the big vulnerabilities of human beings, which is their social nature, If you think about this, this is an evolutionary battle between a virus that literally preys on our social nature in transmitting itself and humans who increasingly want to interact, be mobile, and be more and more in social places, which means that the virus can transmit and evolve. So that battle royale, if I can call it that, very much caught humanity off guard. We do very little in a collaborative way. Just look at climate change. And there are many other things, refugee crisis, where it divides us. It does not bring us together. But it took a virus to actually bring people together in a somewhat slow, clumsy way, I would say, but certainly a year into it, there's a lot more pan-country collaboration, which we very much appreciate. But when we started, countries, continents thought this was their problem to solve on their own. We interacted with many of them, and we could see the very different mindsets. Some wanted proof that a vaccine could work, let alone what they thought was an untested vaccine, and they waited for that proof. And by the time the proof came, they just realized they were quite late in the lineup.
So now 18 months into the pandemic, are you seeing countries become more collaborative with each other, more cooperation on the ground, perhaps, in getting these vaccine supplies?
I think we're beginning to see signs of that, certainly with the U.S. opening up to enabling others. Clearly the U.S. has spent more, done more in finding solutions, and now it has to share with the world. And I'm very pleased to see the U.S. government take steps in that direction, most notably recently at the G7, and it's continuing. Certainly Europe is beginning to take some concrete steps. And we'd love to see more of that. We hear the calls from African countries, we hear the calls from South America, but the reality is that the supply chains that have been established to make the billions of doses already that are being ramped up to be made for this year and then, of course, next year, that's going to have to be further expanded, and that's going to take coordination. So I think that increasingly the will is there, the narrative is there. Now we have to come through on it.
What about increasing the supply itself? I know that Moderna has said that you won't be enforcing patents for the mRNA technology during the pandemic period, but the intellectual property waiver conversations continue at the WTO. If this is actually passed, will this set a precedent that perhaps is not good long-term for the industry?
Well, we recognized early on that, at least as it related to mRNA, the vast technology platform that we had invested in several $billion before this pandemic started could potentially play a role, not only with us, but in terms of others being able to use the technology. And we decided that last October, as you mentioned, we announced that during the pandemic, we would not be enforcing our intellectual property on others who are using it to combat the pandemic. We believe that makes some of the alternative approaches less necessary, less important. And importantly, I think anything we do now has to take into account the future pandemics, future generally drug development, and whatever can be done not to discourage innovation, I think is an important role for governments to play. And others have said, and I'll repeat here, that the major challenge to supply is not distributed production. It's actually supply chains to have enough of the input raw materials to make things at large scale. And the best people who can scale it up are the people who already have. Moderna has said that it will reach upwards of 3 billion doses next year. I think Pfizer has said even a slightly higher number. Between those two numbers, plus several of the other manufacturers, I think you're looking at well north of 10, 15 billion doses. So starting from scratch today, setting up a facility to produce mRNA or any other vaccine is going to at most matter to the next pandemic. I don't see how it matters to the current one based on where we are already.
Talking about equitable vaccine access to the world, we do have a couple of polls for our audience. Now, the first question would be, how should the global vaccination rollout be prioritized? You can actually answer those questions on your browser. The second poll asks, are vaccine passports a good idea? Once you answer those questions, you can actually see the results right away. So, Anoubar, continuing our conversation on equitable access, what else can Moderna do? What other solutions are there other than, say, IP waivers and supply chains, helping build a more resilient supply chain in these vaccine shot distributions?
I think that what's going to become important is to continue to work with the entities that are taking on the kind of pan-nation supply. That is the coordination role, also the consistency of demand. In other words, it's very difficult for a supplier to ramp up and spend its own capital if the outlook is uncertain. Of course, people who want to access vaccines want infinite flexibility, not to take it, to take it much later. And all of those things, unfortunately, run counter to robust supply and production. And so I think there has to be a clear, coordinated effort to make sure that we know what kind of volumes can be produced, how that's going to go from the manufacturing floor all the way to the arm of individuals. And there's a lot of work to be done in many, many places. We continue to make advances in storage. So, for example, we've said it used to be that we could store our vaccine at room temperature. Now we've increased that in refrigerated. We said a month. Now it's much more than that. So the technology keeps improving, but the logistics, the coordination, there's more and more work to be done there, I think, until we're quite sure that we vaccinated a large subset of the population.
Numer, we continue talking about managing this outbreak, managing the pandemic. Let's talk a little bit about preventing the disease altogether, right? What lessons are we taking from here so we don't face another crisis, another health crisis of this magnitude?
Well, there's a couple of things that I'd like to point out. First of all, I think there is a fundamental relationship we have with our health that it would be useful to reconsider. I hear on Bloomberg and other programs these days how much people are reconsidering their lives, their livelihoods, their jobs, their relationships post-pandemic. Well, I'd like to throw in there our relationship with health, something we could reconsider. And why do I say that? If you look at our current healthcare system, it's largely focused on not healthcare, but disease care, sick care. And by far the vast, vast majority of our money, 95, 97%, is spent on things that happen after we're sick. So upstream from that, there's very little money, attention, government support that goes in. And indeed, all of vaccines, all of early detection of threats goes into that. So first, I think we need to, as societies, say, you know what? We need to deal with these things before they happen, pre-disease states. And by the way, this doesn't only apply to pandemics. This applies to infectious diseases. This applies to any disease. Turns out that long before cancer manifests, there are biological states that take place that can be intervened with. Same with cardiovascular disease, same with diabetes. So I think one important takeaway is, should we think of our health as a matter of security instead of care? Just like we think of our physical security, and we ask our governments through the defense efforts, through counteracting terrorism, through any number of means to protect us from these threats. I think if we start thinking from a security standpoint and thinking of medicine as something you do preemptively, not reactively, I think these are fundamental shifts in where we should put dollars, euros, where we should put the best minds to work. And that's going to take a lot of work, because our current regulatory systems, our current reimbursement systems simply encourage waiting for the disease to fully take hold, only to then come along with very, very powerful potential treatments or cures.
Right.
No wonder it costs so much. No wonder it takes that long. We're waiting too long.
So Flagship Pioneering just raised $3.4 billion for a new fund. How are you bringing this vision that you talk about in actually putting money where your mouth is?
Well, a significant portion of our new cycle of innovations, Flagship is all about making breakthrough innovations and creating the next generation of bioplatform companies out of them. And that's what Mrna is. 10 years ago, it was the beneficiary of the expertise and capital and people we deployed into that project. And 10 years later, we're doing that quite at an even larger scale. This new capital pool will add to the remainder that we've had in the past and will accelerate even further doing these very things. But in particular, looking at preemptive medicine and health security as a major important area. For example, can we develop completely new early detection technologies for cancer? Could we detect long before cancer manifests early signs that can be acted on? neurodegenerative disease, same category. Could we have interventions that years before one gets to a point where they have rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, autoimmune diseases, could we have taken steps that delay or deter the ultimate disease? And of course, in infectious disease, can we create surveillance? Can we create much more rapid action when we see these threats coming? We're using, for example, AI machine learning these days to forward project all the different variants, not only from SARS-CoV-2, but from influenza and for many other viruses, because we have the data now to be able to track ahead of its time what the virus may do and anticipate it and combat it. All of that is ahead for us, and it's an exciting time, although it took a pandemic and lots of loss to bring this to the forefront.
So is this sort of thinking going to help when it comes to slow pandemics and not just fast pandemics like we've had this time around, where you've had all of this effort globally come together?
Well, it's a great question, because one of the interesting observations, you roll back the clock a year and everyone was speculating that vaccines that take less than 3-4 years to develop are by definition unsafe and cannot be made and cannot be trusted. And, we and Pfizer and others did trials that were as big, if not bigger, than what one typically sees, showed robust data on safety and efficacy, and rolled it out. And in the field, basically the vaccine's been doing the same or better than what the tests had showed, and now across hundreds of millions of people. And so there's a lot of learning there. But the question is, after the pandemic, let's say, wanes somewhat, are we going to go back to saying, okay, now it has to take 5 years again to develop a vaccine? Or are we going to, as a regulatory process, come up with ways to take the learnings and work with industry, work with others in the medical community to do the same robust type of work, but in a collaborative way, perhaps faster? We watch slow pandemics, cancer, Alzheimer's, obesity, take lives by the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands per year. But somehow there's nothing urgent about that, because that's considered business as usual. I think some level of intolerance to the status quo, that diseases are meant to take lives and hurt people, and therefore that's okay, but a virus, that's different. In my view, it's not different. It's not different. If you lost a family member, as I've lost 2 parents to cancer, to me, frankly, that's a very important threat that I live with, and that my family and everybody I know lives with. Why not apply the same type of intensity and collaboration and motivation to that disease? I think we could do a lot better.
20 seconds, Nubar. Are there any global institutions that could lead the way?
I think that this is going to be a collaborative effort between research institutions, the private sector, governments, very importantly, because they're all over the policy and regulation side to this. And then we have to see whether health security should be the subject of some national pan-government effort. I don't think we need yet more institutions, but we need to make sure the institutions have the right signal and the right mandate to work on the right set of problems.
Nubar Afeyan, co-founder and chairman of Mrna and CEO and founder of Pioneer, Flagship Pioneering. Thank you very much for your time today. It was good seeing you again.
Thank you, Sherry. Thanks for having me.
You're watching the Qatar Economic Forum powered by Bloomberg. We've heard from global leaders and we've explored the most crucial issues of the day. We'd like to thank our underwriters in Qatar, Media City, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and the investment promotion agency Qatar. We leave you with a performance from the Qatar Philharmonic Orchestra. The pearl trade was a major pillar of the Qatari economy. It even lent itself to an art form, a gentle music called Fijiri, which means music of the sea. This haunting composition by Dana Al-Fradan merges that indigenous music with a Western influence. It's a perfect metaphor for the melding of the local and global in our hyper-connected world. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. In Swahili, Kwaheri.